And I taught my students, as I always did, that words don't have a literal meaning. Words have a range of potential meanings. It's the context that determines the meaning. And one of my students, I remember, asked the question. They said, if that's the case, why does the NIV, this was long before I was on the committee, why does the NIV translate the Greek word adelphoi as brothers instead of brothers and sisters? Because it clearly means siblings.
Welcome to the Eden Podcast, where we true the verse of Genesis 3:16, and we discover that God didn't curse Eve or Adam or limit woman in any way.
This is the Eden Podcast, and I'm Bruce C.E. Fleming. The True 316 Foundation is the home of the Eden Podcast, and the website is tru316.com. That's true316.com. And we are on Media Monday when we interview podcasters and authors and other key people that our audience wants to get to know. Let me throw it to our co-host, Joanne Hagemeyer, and we'll go from here.
Thanks, Bruce. We're here with Dr. Mark L. Strauss, who serves as vice chair of the Committee on Bible Translation for the New International Version, and also is an associate editor for the NIV Study Bible. He got his PhD from Aberdeen and is now University Professor of New Testament at Bethel Seminary, where he has served since 1993. He's the author and co-author of 15 books and many articles, and he's also editor and co-editor of over 40 volumes with expertise in the New Testament, Gospels, hermeneutics, and Bible translation. He's married to Roxanne, a marriage and family therapist, and they have 3 grown children. We're glad to have you with us, Mark.
Great to be here. Thanks, Joanne and Bruce.
We like to start with stories and pass those on, especially the good stories. And Mark, would you tell us your faith story? How did you come to know Jesus?
Yeah, I have the privilege of being born in a Christian family. My father was a pastor, and my grandfather actually was a pastor and a conference speaker for most of his life. And so I grew up in a Christian home where Christ was talked about, and we attended church, and I accepted Christ shortly after my brother, who's just 10 and a half months older than me, at a very young age, and really believed that was an authentic confession of faith. I remember having feeling I had a relationship with God and praying regularly. As many do, I wandered from that faith in my high school and college years. Came back to faith, especially through working. I worked with a Young Life program, a summer Young Life program in Missouri, Silver Dollar City, Missouri. And that really, that service really brought me back to where I felt like God was calling me to some kind of ministry to serve him really full time in some capacity. So that really a very early age came to faith, and then really heard the call of God to serve in my high school and college years, especially.
So somehow you ended up as a university professor from that early stage with Young Life. I like hearing that because I used to work with Youth for Christ, and we used to go out to the county fairs, and we'd have any way we could, we'd get people into our tent, and then we'd talk to them about the Lord and tried to lead them to Christ. So there are really good experiences we can have in our younger years. But now you're in your mature stage. How did you get to Bible translation work from there?
Yeah, I was actually in college. I was a psychology major, and I was thinking maybe I would go into professional counseling. I did mostly experimental psychology in college, working on rats, got kind of disenamored with psychology in that context. But I loved history and I loved the Bible. And so I took some courses at seminary prior to what I thought I might go on to graduate school of psychology. And I never left seminary, basically. I loved the classes. I loved the study of the Bible, especially the academic study, the study of the history and context and background and language. And so I didn't really feel a call to ministry, but I did feel that God was leading me in that direction. And so after seminary, I married my wife, Roxanne, during our seminary days. After seminary, I was looking for a position, a ministry position, interviewed for some youth positions, kind of a starting point for ministry. Nothing seemed to be opening. My wife and I were considering missions. We actually went on a fact-finding missions trip. God closed that door as well, quite clearly at that time. And so we were wondering, what does God want? The ministry positions were not working out. The missions positions were not working out. And then I got an offer to teach at a Christian college, teach a few classes, and took that offer and just loved it and felt like God was really blessing that ministry. And that's then the direction. It was clearly said at that point. I received a scholarship to go overseas and study, got accepted in the PhD program at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland to study with I. Howard Marshall, who many Americans and Canadians have taken that trek to Aberdeen to study with him. And that has been the course of my life, really. God has kept me in the academic realm. What's ironic is I really didn't believe I had ministry gifts in terms of preaching and teaching in the church. But during my graduate work, my PhD work, I began getting offers to teach in churches in Scotland. And then when I came home, I began to teach more and more. And so I have gone into ministry since then. In many ways, I've served as an interim pastor, I think 4 interim pastorates, have taught regularly. I've cut back in recent years because of age and other issues. But for the most part, every Sunday for most of my career, I've been preaching or teaching somewhere. So that ministry door did open up, but it opened up late after I had gone the academic route. I really felt like God really directed me to be a trainer of pastors rather than specifically to serve as a pastor. Or maybe I could say a pastor of pastors as opposed to serving a particular individual congregation.
It makes me think about my ordination. Dr. Arthur P. Johnston, he said, preach the word in season, out of season, so I'll just preach the word. So you're doing that. That's really good to
in every
learn.
Context. Absolutely. Yeah.
So you've got a new book. It's part of the 40 Questions series. How does it add to the series, and what do you have in the book?
Yeah, the book is 40 Questions on Bible translation and language in particular, but especially Bible translation has been a passion of mine. Started really as a hobby in many ways. I mean, it's related to biblical studies. Obviously, it's related because we study the Greek and Hebrew in biblical studies and because the Bible is our text. So Bible translation was fascinating to me, especially how language functions. And I got involved in writing a bit on that area. And then a controversy arose in the 1990s. We can talk about that if you like, that I really went full on into the translation questions and issues and was asked, because of that work, especially was asked to join the NIV committee, the CBT, the Committee on Bible Translation. And since then, I've been working consistently in the field of Bible translation, as well as my New Testament studies and teaching at Bethel Seminary.
What were you working on that caught the attention of the NIV translation team?
Yeah, it's interesting, the stories. In the 1990s, my career was young. I was in my first 5 years of teaching. I was teaching a Greek class on Philippians. It was a Greek exegesis class on Philippians. And when I teach Greek, I always tried to bring in the linguistic component because there's a lot of misuse and abuse of Greek, primarily because of misunderstanding of how language works. And I taught my students, as I always did, that words don't have a literal meaning. Words have a range of potential meanings. It's the context that determines the meaning. And one of my students, I remember, asked the question. They said, if that's the case, why does the NIV, this was long before I was on the committee, why does the NIV translate the Greek word adelphoi as brothers instead of brothers and sisters? Because it clearly means siblings or brothers and sisters in these contexts. And I said to the class, doesn't brothers sound inclusive to you? And I'm probably showing my age a bit, right? Every one of them said, no, it sounds exclusive. It's clearly related to men. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Maybe we've mistranslated this word as brothers instead of brothers and sisters, because it clearly means that in context. So I wrote a little article called Gender Bias in Bible Translation and presented it at a conference. It was just one of the breakouts at the conference, and hardly anybody came to that particular paper. But a few months later, a huge controversy broke out in the U.S. over gender-related language. And I just happened to be writing on that topic. I wrote a book called Distorting Scripture, ? The Challenge of Bible Translation and Gender Accuracy. And I started to debate the opponents of that. And that's a long story. We can talk about who those opponents or what that context was in. But that then was really what got the attention of the NIV committee, which was moving in the direction of introducing what we would call gender accurate or gender inclusive language into the NIV. And so because of my work in that area, I was invited to join the committee.
Did that surprise you that it was so controversial, or were you expecting it somewhat?
Oh no, I wasn't. It did surprise me. I actually heard someone do a paper at a biblical studies conference against it, and I thought that's a terrible paper. Linguistically, it's so incredibly naive. It misses the point. It doesn't recognize that the Greek word anthropos means person. It doesn't mean man. Historically, we've used the word man generically, but English has clearly changed. We simply don't use man generically nearly as much as we used to, and it's open to misunderstanding. So to translate anthropos as person, as in anthropology, the study of people, not the study of males, to translate it as person is more accurate because it's more precise. It's not some kind of feminist agenda, which is what these opponents were saying, to undermine the biblical text. It's actually the most accurate possible translation of that word. And so what my opponents were saying in attacking the NIV and other translations was just linguistically wrong. It was hermeneutically wrong. And so I just started challenging this with what I considered to be common sense linguistics. And it really did catch on. Ironically, these same versions that were opposing it have now gone to the same kind of language 20 or so years later, recognizing that this is just good, accurate translation. It's not some kind of agenda that's trying to drive the text.
I mean, that's a fascinating story. I think of your background in both psychology and academia. And it seems like this story that you're now talking about was a swirl of both, wasn't it? An emotional reaction as well as an intellectual one.
Sure. And we need to use our minds as Christians. We need to be better than our opponents in terms of our critical thinking, rather than responding with just emotions. And that's what happened. When it was a World Magazine article called The Stealth Bible, and they had a picture of a stealth fighter on the cover of it. The NIV is quietly going gender neutral. That was the subtitle there. And it was like this big secret conspiracy to overthrow the church. And it was just nonsense. It's really sad because people were signing petitions, whole denominations were coming out against it before they'd even seen it and read it and examined the issues on both sides. I was asked to start lecturing and teaching on this, and we would go around the country to different places. And people were shocked when they learned the basic facts, that this is just good translation principles. This is how we translate the text most accurately. And so, it was a common sense approach to the issue that I think in many ways won the day. But it was years and years before really, I think people began to recognize
you used your academic ability really to bridge the academic world in a way with regular folk.
Right. Yeah.
Which
and
isn't
that's so
that
important.
Yeah.
I think too often we are in the ivory towers of academia, and we don't bring what we're learning into the church. And that creates huge problems down the road because our young people in particular, we don't tell them the truth in many ways about the text of the Bible, how it was copied over the centuries, for example, or the way language functions in the Bible. And instead in church, we tend to speak in absolutes. And they get into college and they hear, challenges to that make sense because they haven't really been taught to think critically, to examine both sides of the issues and to come to good conclusions based on the facts, as opposed to based on sort of what our tradition has told us along the way.
Just out of curiosity, it's a little bit off topic, but what you've just described is a wonderful teaching principle when training pastors. You called yourself maybe a pastor of pastors. Do you find yourself using this principle as you teach and train?
All the time. One of the things I tell my students is don't ever criticize a point of view until you can defend it. In other words, until you know the best arguments in support of it, you don't really understand it. And too often we immediately react and we take a term, Black Lives Matter, for example, or woke, being woke, and we take that term and suddenly that term becomes the bad guy. And we don't even understand what we're talking about. We're just attacking. It's because it's the other. It's the opponents. And we need to listen, first of all. We need to sit and listen and understand where this perspective is coming from and why it's arisen. It's arisen for a reason. It exists for a reason. What is that reason? And why are people so passionate about it? And only when we understand it and can defend it, I would say, because you don't really truly understand a position until you know the arguments well in defense of it, then you can learn to critique it. And then you can say, okay, but this aspect is not true, or this aspect is fallacious. But to do that, we tend to knee-jerk and immediately react against something before we really, really understand it or its roots.
You're making me want to be a student in one of your classes.
I grew up in the Evangelical United Brethren Church, so you could already hear the problems with that label, Evangelical United Brethren. I remember pastors would stand. Now there's a congregation mainly women, and the pastors would say, "Welcome, brethren." So, and for me back then, I don't think that pastor thought about it.
Yeah.
But these days, if you say it that way, the language has changed. The language has changed, and we got to be more precise in what we're doing.
And ironically, on that one, brethren is viewed as more inclusive because it's so archaic, right? The problem is it's archaic, but people would say, well, that in my mind, I can imagine women part of the brethren, but not part of the brothers. So there's a tension there. Do you make it contemporary, or do you make it archaic?
Yeah. So your book is 40 questions. You want to give us one or two of the questions that you ask and answer in your book?
Sure. This was a fun book to write because most books on translation, I've written a number of books on translation, they deal with the philosophy of translation, or they deal with surveying English Bible translations, or the history of Bible translation, or the King James Version's history. The good thing about having 40 short questions, they're about 2,500 words each, is that you can deal with the gamut. And so we deal with what is Bible translation, what are the goals of Bible translation, but also what are the challenges in Bible translation related to culture, for example, related to the meaning of words that we talked about. Then we talk about the history of translation. So we talk about the history of the Septuagint, the Greek translation, and the history of the English translation. Of course, the King James Version is dominant in that whole history. Where did the King James come from? What was before the King James? What came after the King James? What's right or wrong with the King James Version? There's a controversial topic, right? And then we survey modern translations as well. And then I actually have a section, one of my 5 sections is on international Bible translation. I'm no expert in that, obviously. I do mostly English Bible translation, but I've learned enormously from international Bible translators who are some of the most brilliant linguists as well as biblical scholars in the world. And so I have a section that's talking about, what are the major translations in the world, the biggest world languages, who doesn't have a Bible yet, and who is working to give them a Bible. Yeah. And then the final chapter is actually what is one of the most controversial issues in international Bible translation, and that is the question of how do you translate Son of God in Muslim-sensitive translations. And so we do the gender issue with reference to English translations, because that's the big controversial issue in English translations. But then with international Bible translation, that Son of God debate has been huge and has really been controversial. And so just one question dealing with sort of the issues involved in that. So what was fun about this is I got to survey sort of the entire field by dealing with 40 different questions related to translation.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Was there a question that surprised you, or that made you stop a moment saying, I don't know that I have an answer for that right away?
All of them. Yeah. I came up with the question. And so I do lead students through them. Right. They didn't give me the questions. And so I proposed the questions, and they changed over time. They certainly did nuances. I was happy with how it eventually came out, but I had to work through the questions in order sort of to know what to ask in some ways, because one question would lead to another, for example.
So how about the CBT?
I'm sorry.
Can I ask about the CBT? So what's your process? Where are you right now in the latest revision, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a great question. The CBT is the Committee on Bible Translation for the NIV, the New International Version. Mm-hmm. The CBT has met since the 1960s, before the NIV was even published. It was the committee that oversaw the translation of the NIV from scratch. And so there were over 100 scholars who did the translation, but the CBT is a 15-member group that oversees the translation. And they have met annually ever since, because translation is never finished. It's never finished because biblical scholarship continues. We discover new things, better ways to express the meaning of the text. And then English, of course, the English language changes. And so we have to modify and adapt to to changes in English so that the text remains accurate and clear. We mentioned the King James Version. One of the challenges with the King James Version is word meanings have changed. And so what the text today says isn't what it meant when it was originally translated in many cases. And so keeping the text accurate. So we meet every year, usually for a week during the summer. People make proposals. Scholars send in proposals to us. Lay people send in proposals. Pastors send in proposals. Whole denominations sometimes will send in proposals. And the proposals are brought before the committee, and we read them and study them ahead of time. Then we discuss them when we come together for that week, and we vote on them. And we don't change the text easily. It takes a supermajority of 70% to change the text. So most proposals do get turned down. When they do get passed, they don't go directly into the text, of course. It would be terrible if we put out a new edition every year. That would drive people crazy. So the 2011 is the latest edition of the NIV. And the proposals we've voted on and agreed upon since then will all be placed in the next edition. And when that comes out, I can't tell you, because it is the Biblica, which formerly the International Bible Society, who oversees our work. They're the ones who support us, who sponsor us. We are independent of them in that they don't tell us how to translate. It's an independent body of Old and New Testament scholars. They don't tell us how to translate, but they hold the copyright to the NIV, and they determine when to publish it and what products to produce. Zondervan is the primary commercial publisher of the NIV, but the International Bible Society, or Biblica as it's now called, is the copyright holder.
So we need to be praying for the committee, right?
Absolutely.
Every year, every member. So, and you've got half dozen people on the committee. How many are on the committee?
There are 15 on the committee, and they are made up of roughly half and half Old Testament and New Testament scholars. We seek diversity on the committee because it's the new international version. In other words, it's an English version, but it's international in scope. So we have Brits, people from the UK on the committee. We have people from India, people from Africa, Anglophone Africa, Australia, Canada, because English is different in different parts of the world, and people hear things differently. There is actually a British edition. There's a UK edition that has different spelling, because, of course, the Brits spell things wrong, as we know. So spell things differently, of course. Yeah. And so there is a British subcommittee, and the Hodder and Stoughton publishes the NIV in the UK. So yeah, that's international. We try to have gender diversity. We have women on the committee, of course. We have denominational diversity, all evangelicals in the sense that all hold a very high view of Scripture, yet they come from a diverse denominations within that evangelical tradition. So those are some of the things that guide our choice. The committee is self-selecting in that when a position opens up, then people propose names. The person, of course, we're looking for diversity. As I said, we're also looking for someone who agrees with our philosophy or approach to translation. There's great chemistry in the committee. It's been remarkable. One of the things that keeps many of us on the committee is that this week is one of the most joyful times of our year, I think, because you've got this body of brilliant scholars that I'm in awe of, these other scholars, and they'll propose something, and we'll discuss it and vote on it. And sometimes they get voted down. Sometimes you'll have a brilliant scholar who just wrote a commentary on this passage, right? And they get voted down. And it's to see the humility, to see them just say, okay, let's go on to the next one. Has just been really amazing for me. So I've really enjoyed my time on the committee. It's a great group of men and women.
We were privileged to have our launch committee at the launch of the True 316 Foundation, and at that event we had Dr. Janine Brown. So she's also a New Testament professor and also connected with Bethel, like you are. So
absolutely, and a great contributor on the NIV committee.
We were delighted to have her, and we're delighted to have you. Well, there's so much more we got to do, we got to talk about, and we can't right now. So what I'd like to do is, Joanne, you and we'll put in the links. All right, put in some more information to what the publications are that Mark's done, and the various ways they can keep up with you, and also track with the NIV, and what's the next sermon you'll be preaching up in San Diego at your local church, and whatever we think is relevant, we'll try to have that in there for you, Mark.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right.
True 316 Foundation is the home of the Eden Podcast. Join us for $3.16 a month or more. Let's true the verses on the key passages on women and men. Go to true316.com/partner.